I never imagined that my own blood would be capable of stabbing me in the back with such coldness. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer in Portland, and for 2 whole years my entire family treated me like the villain of the story, while my younger brother, the family darling, wove a web of lies so elaborate that not even I could defend myself. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This story will show how the truth, however painful, always finds a way to come to light. It all started on Thanksgiving 2021, when my mother called me crying, saying she was disappointed in me. I had just left an important meeting about a bridge construction project in Vancouver and almost crashed my car when I heard what she had to say. Apparently, I had refused to lend my brother Josh $15,000 to pay off his credit card debt, and had told him to his face that he was a failure who would never amount to anything in life. The problem is, none of that had happened. Josh never asked me for a penny, and I would never say something so cruel to my own brother. I tried to explain to my mother that it was a lie, that Josh had never contacted me, that I didn't even know he was having financial problems. She hung up on me. My father texted me saying he was ashamed to call me his son. My older sister, Rebecca, posted a cryptic message on Facebook about selfish people who forget where they came from. I was completely lost, sitting in my truck in the construction site parking lot, staring at my phone and trying to understand what the hell was going on. I called Josh immediately. He answered with that soft voice he always used, that pitiful tone that worked so well with my parents. I asked him directly about the money and the supposed conversation we had. He sighed deeply and said I didn't need to pretend, that he understood I was going through a difficult time in my marriage, and maybe that's why I was being so bitter. Difficult time in my marriage. My wife Amanda and I had been together for 12 years and had never been happier. Our 2 daughters, Emma and Sophie, were healthy. I had just received a promotion. We had bought a new house in a great neighborhood. Josh kept talking, saying he forgave my harshness, that family was family, and that he hoped one day I could be a better brother. Before I could respond, he hung up. I sat there completely stunned, trying to process what had just happened. My brother had made up a whole story, portrayed me as the villain, and then played the victim when I confronted him. It was insanely brilliant. I got home that night and told Amanda everything. She knew me well enough to know I was telling the truth, but even she was confused by the situation. Why would Josh do something like that? He was always the baby of the family, the youngest that everyone protected, but he never showed any kind of malice or cruelty. He worked as a manager at a Target store, lived in a modest apartment in Gresham, and had a girlfriend named Brittany who seemed nice the few times we met at family gatherings. Amanda suggested I go to my parents' house in person to clear things up. The following weekend, I drove the 40 miles to Lake Oswego, where they lived in a comfortable house my father had bought after retiring from Boeing. When I arrived, my mother opened the door but didn't invite me in. She stood there on the threshold, arms crossed, looking at me as if I were a stranger. I tried to explain again that Josh was lying, that I never had that conversation with him, that I would be more than willing to help him if he really needed it. My mother shook her head sadly and said I'd always been too proud to admit my mistakes. She said Josh had cried on the phone with her, recounting every detail of our supposed conversation, including the tone of voice I used and the exact words I spoke. How could she doubt her son when he was so clearly hurt? I felt my heart sink in my chest. Josh hadn't just lied. He'd prepared. He'd fabricated details. He'd played the victim perfectly. My father appeared behind my mother and told me I should leave. He said that when I was ready to apologize to my brother and fix the damage I caused, they would be willing to talk. Until then, I wasn't welcome in their house. I drove back to Portland with tears in my eyes, something that hadn't happened since my oldest daughter was born prematurely, and spent 2 weeks in the neonatal ICU. The difference is that this time I had Amanda by my side and the certainty that everything would be all right. Now, I only had the feeling of losing my family because of lies I couldn't even fight. The following weeks were a silent hell. No one in the family called me. My cousins stopped answering my messages. At Christmas, I wasn't invited to the annual dinner at my parents' house, a tradition we'd maintained for decades. Amanda took the girls to visit her grandparents in Spokane, and I spent the day alone, eating Chinese takeout and trying to understand how my life had turned upside down so quickly. Josh posted photos of the dinner on Instagram, all smiles next to our parents, with a caption about family and forgiveness. What I didn't know yet was that first lie was just the beginning. Josh had discovered he could use me as a scapegoat for anything that went wrong in his life, and he was only beginning to explore that power. In the following months, the stories became increasingly elaborate, crueler, and more impossible to refute. And I, too innocent, still thought that eventually the truth would come out on its own. But the truth doesn't magically appear. Sometimes you have to dig it out of the ground with your own hands, even if it means getting covered in mud and blood in the process. And that's exactly what I had to do. Because in the end, when you discover how far someone is capable of going to destroy you, there's no other option but to fight back with the same intensity. And I turned over every stone, investigated every lie, gathered every piece of evidence until I had enough ammunition to blow up the entire castle of lies my brother had built upon my reputation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to that terrible winter of 2022, when Josh escalated his lies to a level I never imagined possible. That's when I discovered he wasn't just sabotaging my family, he was destroying my professional life too. And that's when I realized my little brother, the boy I taught to ride a bike and defended from bullies at school, had become my worst enemy. The war was just beginning, and I didn't yet know I was on the battlefield. In February 2022, my boss called me into his office with an expression I'd never seen before. Mark Henderson was a straightforward guy. We'd worked together for 6 years at Morrison & Associates, one of Oregon's largest civil engineering firms, and he'd always been fair to me. But that day he seemed uncomfortable, shuffling papers on his desk and avoiding eye contact. When he finally spoke, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Someone had called the company his HR department, alleging that I was diverting project funds and using firm connections for personal business. The call had been anonymous, but whoever it was had specific details about projects I was working on, client names, contract values. Mark said that obviously they didn't believe the accusations, that my track record spoke for itself, but that they needed to formally investigate because it was company protocol. I would be temporarily removed from key projects while the internal audit took place. My stomach churned. 6 years of hard work, of late nights reviewing blueprints, of sacrificed weekends, all put at risk by an anonymous phone call. I returned to my workstation in shock. My colleagues looked at me with that mixture of curiosity and pity that people have when they know something bad has happened but don't know exactly what. Amanda almost dropped her phone when I told her during lunch. She immediately asked if it could be Josh, but I resisted the idea. As much as he was lying to the family, attacking my career would be crossing a line I couldn't imagine him crossing. But Amanda knew my brother better than I thought. She said that people who lie compulsively have no limits, especially when they find out they can get away with it. The audit took 3 weeks, and, as expected, they found absolutely nothing. My record was clean, every penny accounted for, every decision documented. Mark called me back and apologized for the trouble, said I was completely free of any suspicion, but the damage was already done. Some clients had heard rumors, colleagues were asking indirect questions, and my reputation had suffered a scratch that would take months to heal completely. Whoever had made that call knew exactly how to harm me without leaving a trace. 2 weeks later, I received a message from my sister Rebecca. It was the first time she had spoken to me since Thanksgiving. The message was cold and direct, saying that Josh had told her I was spreading rumors about her having an affair. My blood ran cold. I hadn't said anything about Rebecca to anyone, mainly because she had an apparently happy marriage with her husband Greg for 15 years. I immediately replied, denying everything, saying that Josh was lying, that this was the same thing he had done to me about the money. Rebecca responded with a long, angry message. Josh had shown her screenshots of conversations supposedly between me and other people talking about how I'd seen Rebecca leaving a hotel with an unknown man, how I'd commented that I always thought she was unfaithful, how I'd said Greg deserved to know the truth. The screenshots looked real. They had my profile picture, my name, even my handwriting, but I had never written those messages. Josh had faked everything, probably using some app or simply editing screenshots in Photoshop. I tried to explain this to Rebecca, but she wouldn't listen. She said I'd always been jealous of her for being the firstborn, Dad's favorite, the one who graduated from Berkeley while I went to Oregon State. She said I was trying to destroy the family because I couldn't stand seeing other people happy. She blocked my number before I could respond. I called Greg directly, trying to clear things up, but he didn't want to talk either. The seed of doubt had been planted, and even if Rebecca wasn't having an affair, the trust between them had been shaken. That night, I sat down with Amanda and laid all my cards on the table. Josh had lied about the loan. He probably made the anonymous call to my company. He had forged messages to cause trouble between me and Rebecca. This wasn't about being the family favorite or seeking attention anymore. This was a coordinated campaign to destroy me. Amanda took my hand and said something that completely changed my perspective on the situation. She said that people don't do this without a reason, that Josh must be hiding something big, something so rotten that he needed to create an enemy to divert attention. I started investigating, not in an obvious way, but subtly, like an engineer analyzing a structure looking for flaws. I created a fake Facebook profile and added some mutual friends Josh had, people he knew from Target and his social circle in Gresham. I started paying attention to his posts, the places he frequented, the hours he worked. Within 2 weeks, I had already noticed some inconsistencies. He posted photos in expensive restaurants, in $50 cocktail bars, in designer clothing stores. This didn't match the salary of a Target manager. I hired a private investigator. I know it sounds extreme, but at that point, I needed concrete proof. The investigator, a former police officer named Ron Delgado, charged $150 an hour plus expenses. I explained the whole situation and asked him to follow Josh for 2 weeks, document everything he could, and investigate his finances legally. Ron said he had seen similar cases before, siblings sabotaging each other over inheritance, envy, or undiagnosed mental disorders. But he also said that usually when someone acts like that, there's always a bigger secret behind it. Ron's report arrived 10 days later, and my jaw dropped. Josh hadn't worked at Target for 4 months. He'd been fired for shoplifting, something around $3,000 worth of electronics that he was reselling online. But he kept leaving home every day at work, dressed in his red uniform, and returning at the usual time. Where was he spending his days? Ron had followed him to a tribal casino in Grand Ronde, about 90 miles from Portland. Josh was going there almost every day, playing poker and gambling on slot machines. The photos showed everything. Josh entering the casino at 10 in the morning, leaving at 6 in the afternoon. Sometimes winning, but mostly losing. Ron had even managed to talk to some casino employees who recognized Josh as a regular, someone who was there at least 4 times a week. The numbers simply didn't add up. If Josh wasn't working, where was the money coming from for the casino, for the expensive restaurants, for the lifestyle he flaunted on social media? The answer was in the second part of Ron's report. My parents had opened a line of credit in their name with a limit of $50,000, supposedly to renovate the house. They had given Josh access to manage payments from contractors and purchase materials, but no renovation was happening. Josh was using the money to fund his gambling addiction. He had already burned through almost $35,000 in 6 months. When the money started running out and my parents began asking questions, Josh invented the story about me refusing to lend him money. He created an external villain to explain why he was so stressed, so needy, so desperate. Everything started to make sense in a sick and brilliant way. Josh wasn't just lying out of malice. He was constructing a narrative where I was the cruel and insensitive brother, so that, when the truth about our parents' money came to light, he could say he was suffering, that he was ashamed to ask for help again after I had been so rude the first time. He was using me as a shield, as an excuse, as a scapegoat for every bad decision he made. And the most impressive part is that it was working perfectly. I held that report in my hands for 3 days before deciding what to do. Part of me wanted to go straight to my parents and lay everything on the table, but another part, the part that had been hurt and humiliated, wanted something more. I wanted to expose Josh in the most public and devastating way possible. I wanted every person who believed his lies to see exactly who he really was. Amanda advised me to be cautious, saying that revenge never ends well, but even she was furious about what Josh had done to me, to us, to our family. I decided to wait and gather more evidence. If I was going to destroy my brother's castle of lies, I needed to be absolutely sure he couldn't recover. I asked Ron to continue investigating, to expand the scope, to uncover every dirty detail he could find. What we discovered in the following weeks was so much worse than I imagined that I even felt sorry for Josh. But that pity lasted exactly 5 seconds, because I remembered everything he had done to me. All the nights Amanda found me crying in the bathroom, all the times my daughters asked why Grandma didn't call anymore. The war had escalated, but now I had ammunition, and when the time was right, I was going to use every bullet. In March 2022, Ron called me with an urgency in his voice that I hadn't heard before. He had discovered something that completely changed the game. Josh wasn't just stealing from our parents, he had opened 3 credit cards using their personal information without authorization. The total limit was $80,000, and Josh had already maxed out 2 of them. My parents, who had been meticulous with finances their entire lives, had no idea. Because they thought Josh was taking care of all the bills while my father recovered from knee surgery he had in January. The evidence was irrefutable. Ron had obtained copies of the credit card applications through a contact he had at one of the financial institutions. The signature was forged, but convincing. The billing addresses had been changed to a post office box Josh rented in Beaverton. The statements showed purchases at casinos, online gambling sites, and transfers to PayPal accounts that likely belonged to loan sharks. My brother wasn't just a liar and a compulsive gambler. He was a criminal committing identity fraud against his own parents. I felt a mixture of anger and something close to triumph. Finally, I had concrete, indisputable proof that would show the whole family who Josh really was. But Ron gave me some advice I wasn't expecting. He said that if I simply threw all this on the table now, Josh could invent another story, say he was desperate because of me, that I had refused to help him, and he had no choice. He suggested I wait a little longer, let Josh bury himself even deeper, and then reveal everything at once, without giving him room to maneuver. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, keeping that information to myself while watching my parents continue to treat me like an outcast. In April, it was my mother's 65th birthday. She had dinner at an Italian restaurant in Lake Oswego and didn't invite me. I saw the photos on Facebook, Josh sitting next to her with an expensive gift wrapped up, probably bought with my parents' stolen credit card. My mother was radiant, so proud of her youngest son who never let her down. I had to leave the room where I was working at home because I couldn't look at those pictures anymore. Amanda found me sitting in the backyard, staring blankly. She sat down beside me and didn't say anything for a while. Then she took my hand and said she understood my pain, but that I needed to be strategic. If I exploded now, driven by emotion, I could make mistakes. Josh was clever, manipulative, and had spent months building his narrative. I needed to deconstruct everything with surgical precision, not with blind rage. She was right, as always. I took a deep breath and went back inside, where my daughters were watching cartoons, oblivious to the hell that was happening in their father's life. In early May, Josh made his next move. My cousin Melissa, my mother's sister's daughter, called me in a complete panic. Josh had told her that I had made inappropriate comments about her teenage daughter during a family gathering the previous year. My heart stopped. This was another level of cruelty. Accusing someone of such a thing could completely destroy a life, regardless of whether it was true or not. The mere suggestion was enough to irreparably tarnish my reputation. Melissa was yelling on the phone, calling me all sorts of names, saying she was going to tell her husband and that they were going to take legal action. I tried to stay calm and asked exactly what Josh had said. Apparently, he said he'd heard me making comments about Kayla's body, about how developed she was for her age, about how I'd looked at her strangely. I remembered that 4th of July meeting the previous year perfectly. I'd barely spoken to Kayla, who was 15 at the time, and spent most of her time on the phone with her friends. I asked Melissa to give me 24 hours before taking any action. I told her Josh was lying, that I could prove it, that something much bigger was going on. She hesitated but agreed, mainly because deep down she'd known me for 38 years and knew I wasn't that kind of person. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. Josh had crossed the red line. He wasn't just trying to distance me from my family anymore. He was trying to completely destroy me, to turn me into a monster in everyone's eyes. I called Ron immediately. I told him we needed to speed things up, that I couldn't wait any longer. Josh was escalating the lies into dangerous territory, and I needed to act before he caused irreversible damage. Ron said he had already compiled everything we needed. Over 200 pages of documentation, photos, bank statements, security camera footage from the casino, statements from Target employees about Josh's dismissal. It was all there, a complete picture of my brother's true life. But Ron had one final suggestion before I revealed everything. He knew an investigative journalist who worked for the Oregonian, Portland's leading newspaper. If I really wanted to expose Josh in a way that there was no going back, we could leak the story to the press. Elder abuse was a hot topic, and with all the dramatic details of the story, it would be an easy headline. I considered the suggestion for a few minutes. It would be the ultimate revenge, seeing Josh's name plastered across the newspaper, his black and white photo, alongside words like fraud, manipulation, gambling addiction. But then I thought about my parents. They were private people who valued their reputation in their community. Seeing their family problems exposed publicly would destroy them, regardless of who was to blame. I decided no, I wouldn't involve the press. This would be between us, the Carter family. I would confront Josh in front of everyone with all the evidence and let each person draw their own conclusions. It would be painful, it would be ugly, but it would be private. I started planning the confrontation. My father's birthday was in 3 weeks, at the end of May. Traditionally, we had a barbecue at their house, with the whole extended family. I hadn't been invited this year, obviously, but that didn't matter. I would show up anyway, with Ron and all the evidence in hand. It would be impossible for Josh to run away or make excuses at the last minute, with everything being revealed live to the whole family. Amanda made me promise I wouldn't do anything violent. She knew my anger. She knew how I'd been holding it all in for months. I promised I'd stay calm, that I'd let the evidence speak for itself. But deep down, I knew that when the time came to look into my brother's eyes and see the mask fall, it would be one of the most satisfying and saddest moments of my life. Satisfying because the truth would finally be revealed. Sad because it would mean the complete end of the family I knew. In the weeks leading up to my father's birthday, Josh kept posting on social media photos of him helping my parents with chores, taking my mother shopping, family dinners where everyone seemed happy and together. Each post was a stab in the back, but it was also more fuel for the fire I was about to ignite. He was so confident in his own lie that he wasn't even being careful anymore. This would be his downfall. A week before the planned confrontation, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Brittany, Josh's girlfriend. She was crying, speaking quickly and quietly, as if she were afraid of being overheard. She said she needed to talk to me urgently, that she had discovered things about Josh that would make sense to me, that she was scared and didn't know what to do. We arranged to meet at a Starbucks far from Portland, in a suburb called Wilsonville, where no one would recognize us. What Brittany told me when we met was the final piece of the puzzle, and it was so sordid that even I, who thought I knew all my brother's lies, was shocked. Josh didn't just have one girlfriend, he had three. Brittany was the official one, the one who knew the family. But there were two other women he was simultaneously deceiving, each thinking she was the only one. And he was borrowing money from all of them, promising marriage, a future, children. One of them had lent Josh $20,000 from her retirement account, supposedly to start a business. Brittany had discovered everything by accident when Josh's phone was unlocked while he was in the bathroom. She saw the messages, the photos, the identical promises he made to each of them. When she confronted Josh, he cried, said he had a problem, that he needed help, that he was going to change. But then she overheard him on the phone later that night, telling someone, probably my mother, that I had shown up at her house causing a scene, threatening Josh and scaring her. Yet another lie using my name. Brittany handed me screenshots of all the conversations, photos, and bank transfer receipts. She said she was breaking up with Josh, but wanted him to pay for what he did, not only to her, but to all the other women he deceived. I thanked her and said that in a week everything would come to light and she would get the justice she deserved. When I left that Starbucks, I no longer felt anger. I felt something colder, more focused, absolute determination to expose every lie, every manipulation, every crime my brother had committed. The day of the confrontation was approaching and I was ready. More than ready. I was armed to the teeth with the truth, and this time the truth was going to do more than just come to light. It was going to explode like a nuclear bomb in the middle of our family, and when the smoke cleared, Josh would have nowhere left to hide. The 5 days leading up to my father's birthday were the longest of my life. I reviewed the evidence every night after Amanda and the girls went to bed, organizing everything into folders, making sure every document was in order, every photo was dated and timed, every bank statement highlighted with the relevant amounts. Ron had given me a black executive briefcase where everything fit perfectly organized. It felt like preparing for a trial, and in a way, that's exactly what it was. Amanda was nervous. On the Thursday before my birthday Sunday, she caught me for the 3rd time checking the documents on the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. She sat down beside me and said she was worried about me, that I was obsessed, that even though Josh deserved to be exposed, she feared what it would do to me emotionally. I held her hand and explained that I needed to do this, not just for myself, but for all the people Josh had manipulated and hurt. My parents needed to know their son was a fraudster before they lost everything. On Friday, I received a message from Rebecca. It was short and to the point, saying that she had heard from Josh that I was planning to show up at Dad's birthday party uninvited, and that if I did, she would call the police. I calmly replied that I had every right to visit my own father on his birthday, and that if she wanted to call the police, they would be welcome to witness what I had to reveal. She didn't reply after that, but I'm sure she rushed to tell Josh. Saturday was the hardest day. I took Emma and Sophie to the park, tried to be the present and happy father I've always been, but my mind was completely focused on the next day. Sophie, who was 9 years old and frighteningly perceptive, asked if I was angry with someone. I knelt in front of her and said that sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations, but that she didn't need to worry, that Daddy would be okay. She hugged me and said I was the best dad in the world. I almost cried right there in the middle of the playground. That night, I mentally rehearsed what you would say. I didn't want to seem hysterical or emotional. I wanted to be cold and factual. I would begin by thanking everyone for being there to celebrate my father, apologize for showing up uninvited, and then begin to reveal the evidence one by one. Josh would try to interrupt, try to create a scene, but I had instructed Ron to be there with me as a witness and help maintain order if necessary. Amanda would also be by my side, my anchor of sanity. Sunday dawned with a clear sky, that kind of beautiful late May day in Oregon that reminds you why you love the Pacific Northwest. I put on a light blue dress shirt and jeans, nothing too formal but presentable. Amanda chose a simple dress and brought the girls, because even with everything that was about to happen, they deserved to see their grandparents. Ron would meet me there, arriving separately so as not to raise suspicions too early. We arrived at my parents' house at 3 in the afternoon. The cars were already filling the street. I recognized Rebecca's Subaru, my Uncle Paul's Honda, and my cousin's minivan. The smell of barbecue wafted from the backyard. For a moment I stood still on the sidewalk, holding the black briefcase in one hand and Amanda's hand in the other. She squeezed my fingers and whispered that she was proud of me, no matter what happened. I took a deep breath and walked to the door. I rang the doorbell. My mother opened it, and the smile on her face vanished instantly. I could see Josh in the background in the kitchen, and his expression changed from relaxed to alarmed in a split second. My father appeared behind my mother, confused, and before either of them could speak, I said in the calmest voice I could muster that I needed to talk to everyone, that it was about Josh, and that after that they could ask me to leave if they wanted, but to please give me 15 minutes. My father looked at my mother, then at me, and something on my face must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because he nodded and opened the door completely. We went inside, and the atmosphere in the house changed immediately. Conversation stopped, people began to gather in the living room and kitchen, curious or worried. Josh was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, with that smug smile I had learned to hate in recent months. He thought I was there to cause a scene, and that this would only make me look worse. Rebecca was beside him, protective as always. My father sat in his favorite armchair. My mother stood beside him. There were about 20 people there, uncles, aunts, cousins, my cousin's girlfriend, even some neighbors who were close to the family. I put the briefcase on the coffee table, and Amanda took Emma and Sophie to the backyard with my younger cousin, away from what was about to happen. Ron appeared in the back doorway, discreetly positioning himself where he could see everything but without drawing attention. I started by speaking. I thanked everyone for listening and said that I knew he had been estranged from the family in recent months due to serious accusations made by Josh. He said that initially I tried to defend myself privately, but the lies continued and escalated to a point where there was no choice but to expose the whole truth publicly. Josh rolled his eyes and began to say something, but my father raised his hand, asking for silence. He wanted to listen. I opened the briefcase and took out the first set of documents, bank statements from my parents' account highlighting withdrawals and transfers to the line of credit Josh was managing. I explained that there was no renovation happening, that Josh had burned through $35,000 in casinos in the last 6 months. My mother turned pale. Josh started to babble something about using the money for materials that hadn't even been delivered yet, but I cut him off by showing him photos of Ron at the casino, dated and timed Josh sitting at the poker tables at the slot machines. The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of papers being passed from hand to hand. My father picked up the bank statements and his hands began to tremble. He looked at Josh with an expression I had never seen before, something between disbelief and a deep, cold anger. Josh tried one last card, saying that yes, he had a gambling problem, that he was ashamed to admit it, and that's why he made up the story about me refusing to lend him money, because he was desperate and didn't know how to ask for help. That's when I dropped the next bombshell, the fraudulent credit cards. I put the application copies on the table, pointed out the forged signature, explained about the post office box in Beaverton, the $80,000 credit limit Josh had illegally obtained. This wasn't just a gambling addiction. This was a federal crime, identity fraud, document forgery, theft. Josh could go to prison for this, and it could take my parents years to clean up their credit from the damage he caused. My mother started crying. Rebecca was in shock, looking at Josh as if she was seeing a stranger. Josh tried again, saying he would pay everything back, that he would get help, that none of this would have happened if I had been a better brother, if I had offered help when he needed it. But I was prepared for that too. I showed her the phone records proving that Josh never called or texted me about money. I showed her my GPS location on the day he claimed we had the conversation about the loan. I was in Vancouver at a work meeting 200 miles away. Josh was starting to panic. I could see the sweat forming on his forehead, his hands trembling slightly, but I wasn't finished yet. I put the screenshots of the fabricated conversations Josh had created about me bad-mouthing Rebecca on the table. I brought in a digital forensics expert Ron knew, who had analyzed the metadata of the images and confirmed they were edited in Photoshop. Josh never expected me to go this far to prove my innocence. And then came the final blow, the 3 girlfriends. I put the photos on the table, the conversations where Josh promised marriage to each of them, the receipts for the money he had borrowed. Brittany had even recorded the conversation where she confronted Josh, and he admitted everything before trying to turn the story against me. I played the audio right there, in front of everyone, Josh's voice clear as crystal, admitting that he had 3 simultaneous relationships and that he was using their money to pay off gambling debts. Josh broke down. He literally collapsed on the kitchen floor, began sobbing uncontrollably, apologizing repeatedly. But they were empty apologies, the kind manipulators give when they're finally cornered. My mother moved away from him when he tried to hug her legs. My father simply stared at his youngest son with an expression of utter disgust. Rebecca was crying, probably realizing that everything she had believed in the last few months was a lie, that she had treated her own brother like a villain because of a fraudster. Ronnie approached and discreetly handed me another envelope. It contained the documents regarding Josh's dismissal from Target for theft. I didn't even need to show it. I just held the envelope in the air and said I had even more, that every lie Josh had told in the last few months I could refute with concrete evidence. Josh stopped crying for a moment and looked at me with pure hatred that made me take a step back. He was no longer the little brother I knew. He was a stranger, someone consumed by vices and lies to the point of becoming unrecognizable. My father finally spoke. His voice was trembling but firm. He told Josh to get out of his house immediately, that he didn't want to see him again until he sought professional help and started making restitution for everything he stole. He said they were going to press criminal charges for the fraudulent credit cards, and that Josh was lucky they hadn't called the police at that exact moment. Josh tried to argue, but Rebecca, of all people, was the one who grabbed his arm and dragged him out of the house. When the door slammed shut, the silence was deafening. Then my mother came to me, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me tighter than she had in years. She apologized repeatedly, said she had been a fool, that she should never have doubted me. My father joined the hug, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had my family back. She was broken, traumatized, but she was my family again. The rest of the afternoon was surreal. People stayed in small groups, talking quietly, processing everything that had just been revealed. Some came to apologize for believing Josh. Others just looked at me with a mixture of pity and admiration for having endured months of defamation before revealing the truth in such a devastating way. Amanda returned with the girls, and they ran to hug their grandparents, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded minutes before. But while everyone was processing Josh's breakdown, I felt something strange in my chest. It wasn't satisfaction or joy at the accomplished revenge. It was emptiness. I had destroyed my brother. I had exposed every sin of his to the whole family, and even knowing it was necessary, even knowing he deserved it, part of me died in that process too. The Daniel Carter who entered that house was not the same one who would leave it, but the story wasn't over yet. Josh wasn't the type of person to accept defeat silently, and in the following days we would discover just how far a desperate and exposed man is capable of going to try and save the remains of his own life. The Monday after the confrontation was strangely silent. My phone, which had been silent for months, began to explode with messages from family members apologizing, saying they should have believed me, that they felt terrible for having been manipulated by Josh. Rebecca called me crying, asking for forgiveness for blocking me, for believing the lies about the alleged extramarital affair. She said Greg was relieved too, that the doubt Josh planted had almost destroyed their marriage. My parents scheduled a meeting with me and Amanda at a law office in downtown Portland on Tuesday. They had hired an attorney specializing in financial fraud to begin the process of reversing the damage Josh caused. The lawyer, a man named David Chen, explained that it would be a long and complicated process. The fraudulent credit cards would need to be disputed with each institution, proof of signature forgery would have to be presented, and most likely Josh would have to be formally criminally charged for the companies to take the case seriously. My father looked aged, as if he'd gained 10 years in 3 days. He held my mother's hand while David explained the legal options. The hardest part would be deciding whether they really wanted to press criminal charges against their own son. David was blunt, saying that without the charges it would be nearly impossible to completely clear their name and recover the lost money. With the charges, Josh would likely face 2 to 5 years in federal prison for identity fraud and forgery. My mother couldn't hold back her tears when she heard that. Even after everything Josh had done, even knowing he had systematically lied and stolen, she was still a mother. The idea of seeing her son in prison was unbearable for her. My father was more pragmatic, saying that Josh needed to face real consequences, that this was the only way he might wake up and seek real help. The meeting ended without a definitive decision, but David said they had a few weeks to decide before the legal deadlines began to expire. Josh completely disappeared. Nobody knew where he was. His phone went straight to voicemail. His apartment in Gresham was empty when Rebecca went to check. Brittany texted me saying he had contacted her asking for money to leave the state, that he was afraid of being arrested, that he needed to start over somewhere new. She obviously refused and blocked his number. The other 2 girlfriends, when we managed to contact them through Ron, confirmed that Josh had made the same appeal to both of them. On Thursday, I received a call from a Nevada area code number. It was Josh. His voice was different, harsher, lacking the tearful and regretful tone he used during the confrontation. He said I had made a huge mistake exposing him like that I didn't know who I was messing with, that he had powerful connections, and that I would regret it. I tried to stay calm and ask what exactly he was threatening, but he hung up before I could finish the sentence. Amanda was alarmed when I told her about the connection. She suggested we install security cameras in the house, change the locks, take basic precautions. I thought she was exaggerating. Josh was a liar and a thief, but not a violent one, or at least that's what I thought. Ron was more serious when I told him. He said that desperate men do desperate things, especially when they feel cornered and publicly humiliated like Josh was. The following Saturday, 2 weeks after the confrontation, my car was vandalized. I left in the morning to take the girls to their swimming lesson and found all 4 tires flat. The word traitor scratched into the side paint with some sharp object, and the windshield completely shattered. The neighborhood security cameras didn't capture anything useful, just a figure wearing a hooded sweatshirt approaching my car at 3 in the morning. I couldn't see the face, but the size and body shape resembled Josh's. I filed a police report. The officer who responded, an officer named Martinez, was friendly but realistic. He said that vandalism was difficult to prove without clear evidence, and that even with strong suspicion of who did it, we would need more than just a similar body shape in low-quality video. He suggested that I request a restraining order against Josh, officially documenting the threats and creating a legal record in case something worse happened. I followed Officer Martinez's advice. On Monday, I filed a rectification order against Josh. I had to detail all the threats, the vandalism, the history of lies and manipulation. The judge granted a temporary order, valid for 30 days until the hearing where Josh would have a chance to defend himself. The problem was that no one could find Josh to officially notify him of the order. It completely disappeared, and that made me more nervous than if I knew exactly where he was. Amanda was becoming increasingly anxious. She started looking over her shoulder when she went out with the girls, double-checked that the doors were locked at night, and installed an app on her phone that notified me whenever she arrived anywhere safely. I hated what Josh was doing to our peace, to our sense of security. Even from afar missing, he could still poison our lives. My parents were devastated by how events had unfolded. My mother constantly blamed herself, saying she had failed as a mother, that she should have seen the signs, that Josh had problems sooner. My father was more focused on repairing the financial damage, spending hours on the phone with banks, credit agencies, and lawyers. David Chen had begun the formal process of disputing the fraudulent cards, but it was proving to be an arduous battle. The financial institutions wanted police reports. They wanted formal criminal charges before cancelling the debts. That's when we discovered that Josh wasn't just in debt to banks and casinos. He had borrowed money from loan sharks. Ron received a tip from one of his contacts in the Portland Police Department, someone from the Financial Crimes Division who was investigating an illegal loan ring operating in the metropolitan area. Josh's name came up in their investigations, owing approximately $40,000 to people who wouldn't take no for an answer. That explained a lot. Josh's escalating desperation, the more aggressive threats, the sudden disappearance. He wasn't just running from his family and legal consequences, he was running from criminals who wanted their money back. And if they couldn't find Josh, they would start looking for his family. They would start with me. My stomach churned when Ron explained how these operations worked, how they used intimidation, threats, sometimes violence to ensure payment. The following Wednesday, 3 weeks after the confrontation, 2 men showed up at my construction site. I was supervising the construction of an apartment complex in Hillsborough when a black BMW pulled up and 2 guys got out. Dressed in expensive suits, but with the demeanor of people used to dirty work. They asked for Daniel Carter, and my heart skipped a beat. I took them away from the construction crew to a more private corner of the site. They got straight to the point. Josh owed their boss money, A lot of money, and he'd disappeared. They knew it wasn't my problem, but family is family, and maybe I was interested in helping my brother get out of this situation before it got really bad. I replied that I had no contact with Josh, that he had stolen from me and lied to me too, that our relationship was severed. The taller of the two, a guy with a scar on his chin, smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and said it was a shame, because when they can't find the debtor, sometimes they have to be creative about how to recover the investment. It wasn't an explicit threat, but the message was clear. If Josh didn't pay, they would come after me, my family, anyone who might have resources. I told them they were wasting their time, that I didn't have $40,000 to throw away on my brother's debts, and that if they wanted to find him, they should look in Reno or Las Vegas, where Josh was probably trying to earn enough money to run even further. They exchanged a look, wrote something on a phone, and left without another word. I called Ron immediately afterward. He said I did the right thing by not provoking or challenging those guys, but that I needed to take the situation more seriously. He suggested hiring private security, at least temporarily, until the situation with Josh was resolved one way or another. He also suggested I talk to my parents about paying off Josh's debt to the loan sharks, not as a favor to him, but as protection for the whole family. The idea disgusted me. After everything Josh had done, after all the lies and thefts, now I had to spend $40,000 to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. But Ron was right about one thing. This wasn't about Josh anymore. It was about keeping my wife and daughters safe. Amanda almost panicked when I told her about the men at the construction site. She wanted us to pack up the girls and go to her parents' house in Spokane until things calmed down. I had a long conversation with my parents that night. I explained the situation with the loan sharks, the visit I received, the implications for the whole family. My father was livid with rage, not at the loan sharks or me, but at Josh. He said he wasn't going to give another penny to clean up his son's mess, that Josh had made his choices and needed to live with the consequences. My mother, always the most emotional, begged us to find a solution that wouldn't put anyone in danger, even if it meant paying the money. We spent hours debating, weighing options, each one worse than the last. In the end, we reached an agreement. My parents would pay half of Josh's debt to the loan sharks, $20,000, in exchange for a written agreement that they would leave the family alone and focus only on recovering the rest directly from Josh. I would contribute $10,000, money I had saved for the girls' college education, because I couldn't sleep at night, knowing I had put my family at risk by exposing Josh. David Chen offered to mediate the negotiation with the loan sharks. Apparently, he had experience with this type of situation. There were channels through which lawyers could make deals with illegal lenders without necessarily admitting knowledge of the operation's illegality. It was all very carefully constructed. Documents signed but without real names, money transferred through third parties. Everything designed to legally protect us while resolving the immediate problem. The transaction was completed in a week. The $30,000 were paid, and we received confirmation through David that our part of the deal was fulfilled and that the Carter family was officially off their books. The other $10,000 were Josh's problem now, but at least it was only $10,000, not 40. I felt immense relief when David confirmed it was settled, but also a deep, burning anger. Josh had cost us not just money, not just reputation, not just months of emotional suffering. He had forced us to negotiate with criminals, had put my wife and daughters in real danger, had transformed our peaceful, normal family into something out of a crime movie. And worst of all, he was still out there somewhere, probably unaware or unconcerned about the chaos he left behind. But the universe has a strange way of balancing things out. Because 2 weeks after we resolved the situation with the loan sharks, I received a call that would change everything again. And this time, Josh would be facing consequences that not even I, in the heat of my anger, would have wished for him. The call came from a Las Vegas number at 7 in the morning on a Friday. I was still half asleep when I answered, and on the other end of the line, a professional female voice identified herself as Detective Sarah Kowalski of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. My heart immediately raced. She asked if I was Daniel Carter, brother of Joshua Carter, and when I confirmed, there was a long pause before she continued. Josh was in the hospital, in the ICU at University Medical Center, and I was listed as an emergency contact on his ID. I sat up in bed so quickly that I woke Amanda. I asked what had happened, if Josh was okay, if he was going to survive. The detective explained that Josh had been found unconscious in an alley behind a casino on Fremont Street, brutally beaten with multiple fractures and a head injury. He was in an induced coma while the swelling in his brain subsided. They didn't yet know if there would be permanent damage. She needed someone from the family to go to Vegas to formally identify Josh and make medical decisions if necessary. I froze. Part of me, the wounded and angry part, thought Josh was finally paying for everything he'd done. But another part, the part that still remembered him as the boy I taught to play baseball, felt a deep pain in my chest. Amanda held my hand as I processed the information. The detective said that based on the circumstances and the background they were able to quickly gather, they suspected the beating was related to gambling debts. The loan sharks had found Josh. I called my parents immediately. My mother collapsed when I told her, started screaming hysterically that she needed to go to Vegas, see her son, be by his side. My father was more composed, but I could hear the trembling in his voice. They booked tickets for the first available flight, which leaves Portland at 2 in the afternoon. I said I would go too, perhaps not for the right reasons, but because in the end, Josh was still my brother, and someone needed to deal with the situation practically. Amanda didn't want me to go. She said that after everything Josh did, I didn't owe him anything, that I should let my parents deal with it alone. But I explained that it wasn't about Josh. It was about my parents who were devastated and needed support. Someone needed to keep a cool head while they panicked. Rebecca also booked a ticket on the same flight, and Ron offered to go along if we needed help with any legal or investigative aspects of the situation. The flight to Las Vegas was tense and silent. My mother cried the whole way. My father stared out the window without blinking. Rebecca was on the phone trying to understand the medical details with the hospital doctors. When we landed at McCarran International Airport, the reality of the Nevada desert hit me like a wall of heat. It was June and easily over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We took 2 Ubers to the hospital, a huge complex in the city center. The hospital was chaotic, typical of a large city trauma medical center. Nurses running back and forth, the smell of disinfectant mixed with something more organic and unpleasant, the constant sound of beeping monitors and intercoms calling doctors. We were directed to the ICU on the 4th floor, where Detective Kowalski was waiting for us. She was a woman in her 40s, grey hair tied in a tight ponytail, eyes tired of someone who had seen a lot of bad things in life. She took us to a private room before letting us see Josh. She explained that the beating was extremely violent, that whoever did it wanted to send a clear message. Josh had 3 broken ribs, a fractured jaw in 2 places, a shattered left eye socket, and worst of all, a brain hemorrhage that caused a coma. They had operated the previous night to relieve pressure on his brain, but the next 48 hours would be critical. If he woke up, there was a high possibility of permanent cognitive damage. My mother almost fainted when she heard that. Rebecca held her, and for a moment, all our differences, all the drama of the last few months, evaporated before the brutal reality that Josh could die or wake up as a completely different person. The detective continued, saying they had security cameras showing 3 men following Josh into the alley. but the images were of poor quality, and they couldn't identify their faces. He asked if we had any information about who Josh owed money to, who might have a motive to do this. I told her about the loan sharks in Portland, about the $40,000 debt we had partially paid, about the remaining $10,000 Josh still owed. The detective wrote everything down, said she would coordinate with the Portland police to see if they could identify those responsible. But she was honest with us, saying that cases like this rarely result in arrests because victims and witnesses are afraid to cooperate, and professional criminals know how to leave no evidence. Josh would probably just be another statistic, another victim of gambling debt in Las Vegas. When they finally took us to see Josh, nothing could have prepared me for the sight. My brother, who had always been vain about his appearance, who spent hours in front of the mirror fixing his hair, was unrecognizable. His face was so swollen and purple that it looked like a grotesque mask. Tubes were sticking out everywhere, machines beeped around the bed, and his body looked small and frail under the white hospital sheets. My mother sobbed so loudly that a nurse came to check if everything was all right. We stayed there for hours, alternating between sitting by the bed and going out into the hallway when the emotion became too much. Rebecca was talking to the doctors about prognoses, treatment options, what would happen if Josh didn't wake up. My father was in an almost catatonic state, just staring at his son without saying a word. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me was still angry at Josh for everything he had done. Another part felt irrational guilt, thinking that if I hadn't exposed him publicly, maybe he wouldn't have run away to Vegas. Maybe he wouldn't be in that hospital bed. Amanda called me late in the afternoon to see how everything was going. I explained the situation, and she was silent for a moment before saying something that deeply affected me. She said that Josh had made bad choices, choice after choice, and that eventually those choices led to terrible consequences, but that I wasn't responsible for his choices, that exposing the truth wasn't the same as causing what happened afterward. It was easy to say that rationally, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. On the second night, while my father had gone out to get something to eat and Rebecca was on the phone with her husband, I was alone with my mother beside Josh's bed. She held his hand, careful not to touch the injured areas, and began to speak softly. She said she had failed Josh, that she had spoiled him too much as a child, never letting him face real consequences. She said she had turned him into the darling, the baby of the family who would always be protected, and that this had prevented him from developing responsibility or character. I tried to comfort her, telling her she had been a good mother, that Josh had made his own choices as an adult, but she shook her head and continued. She said that when I exposed Josh that Sunday in front of the whole family, she had been furious with me for a few minutes. Furious because I had shattered the image she had of the perfect son. But then she realized that that image was never real, that she had refused to see who Josh really was for years, and that if she had had the courage to confront his problems sooner, maybe he wouldn't be in that bed now. It was one of the most honest and painful conversations I've ever had with my mother. There in that Las Vegas hospital room, with the sound of the heart monitors and the cold fluorescent light, we finally managed to speak truths that needed to be said for years. About favoritism, about responsibility, about how love sometimes means letting the people you love face the consequences of their actions instead of constantly protecting them. On the third day, Josh woke up. It was sudden, without warning. His eyes simply opened while my mother was changing the flowers in the vase beside the bed. She yelled to call the nurse, and within seconds the room was filled with doctors and equipment. They pushed us outside while they performed neurological assessments, checked his responses, and tested basic cognitive functions. We waited in the hallway for 40 minutes that felt like days. When the doctor finally came out, Dr. Patel was his name, the news was mixed. Josh had woken up and was conscious, which was an excellent sign. But he had significant damage. His vision in his left eye was severely impaired, perhaps permanently. He was having difficulty speaking because of his broken jaw and apparent damage to his facial nerves. And there were signs that his short-term memory was affected, although it was too early to determine the full extent of the cognitive damage. "Sorry, bro." Tears began to stream from his visible eye, and for the first time since it all began, I saw genuine regret. Not the performative regret he showed when he was exposed, but something deeper, more broken. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at what was left of my brother, at the physical result of all the bad choices and lies that had accumulated to this point. Then I leaned closer and said that I forgave him, but that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean trusting again, didn't mean things would go back to the way they were before. I said he had a long road ahead, both physically and in terms of fixing what he had broken, and that it was up to him to decide what kind of person he would be when he left that hospital. Josh nodded slightly, and I could see that he understood. The manipulative glint in his eyes was gone, as was the smug smile I'd learned to recognize as a sign he was plotting something. There was only pain, both physical and emotional, and perhaps for the first time in his adult life, a real understanding that actions have consequences and that no one, not even the family darling, is above facing the reality of their choices. I left the room knowing that our relationship would never be the same. It couldn't be. But I also left with a strange sense of closure, that the worst was over, and that from now on the only possible path was to begin rebuilding, slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries, and eyes wide open to who each of us truly was. We returned to Portland 3 days later, leaving Josh still in the hospital, under the care of a medical team that estimated at least another 2 weeks of hospitalization before he could be transferred to a rehabilitation unit. My mother didn't want to leave him, but the costs of staying in Vegas were quickly piling up, and someone needed to start dealing with the mountain of practical issues Josh had left behind. His health insurance through Target had expired when he was fired, so all the medical bills were coming directly to him, or in this case, to our family. David Chen met with us the day after our return to discuss the full legal and financial situation. The picture he painted was devastating. Between the fraudulent credit cards, the loans Josh had taken out in his own name, the remaining gambling debts, and now the Vegas medical bills that already exceeded $200,000, Josh was buried in debt that would take decades to pay off, assuming he could work again. And with the neurological and physical damage he suffered, that was far from guaranteed. David also brought bad news about the criminal consequences. Even with Josh in the hospital, the financial institutions were pressing charges for fraud. There was an arrest warrant issued, temporarily suspended due to his medical condition, but which would be executed as soon as the doctors released him. Josh would likely face trial within 6 months, and David estimated that even with a plea deal, he would get at least 18 months to 2 years in prison, followed by years of probation and mandatory restitution. My father aged another 10 years while listening to all this. He'd worked 35 years at Boeing, retired with a decent pension, and had savings that should have comfortably lasted until the end of their lives. Now, between paying lawyers, covering some of Josh's debts to protect their own credit, and the medical costs that would inevitably fall on their shoulders, my parents were watching their savings evaporate. The house they loved in Lake Oswego would probably have to be sold. I returned to work the following week, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. Mark greeted me with understanding, saying he'd heard the rumors about the family situation and that if I needed extra time, the company would be flexible. But I needed the distraction of work. I needed something productive and logical to focus on instead of the emotional chaos my life had become. I immersed myself in projects, staying late, reviewing blueprints, checking structural calculations, anything to keep my mind occupied. Amanda had been my rock through all of this. She kept the house running, took care of the girls, and somehow still found the energy to sit with me every night and process everything that was happening. One night, 2 weeks after we got back from Vegas, she asked me how I really felt about Josh. Not the automatic answer I gave everyone, but the deep, messy truth I'd been avoiding facing. It took me a while to formulate the answer. I said I felt a confusing mix of anger, pity, guilt, and relief. Anger for what he did to me and my family. Pity for the state he was in now, and the bleak future he faced. Guilt for wondering if I could have done something differently, if exposing him so publicly was really necessary, or if it was partly about revenge, and relief, shamefully, because finally the truth was out, and I no longer had to bear the weight of being the unjustly accused villain. Amanda listened to everything and then said something that changed my perspective. She said that I had done what was necessary with the information and options I had at the time, that continuing to let Josh lie and manipulate wouldn't have protected anyone. It would only have allowed him to cause even more harm eventually. That what happened in Vegas wasn't my fault. It was the inevitable result of Josh's choices piling up on top of each other until they collapsed. I had exposed the truth. What Josh did with that exposure was his responsibility. Josh was discharged from the hospital in Vegas at the end of June and transferred to a rehabilitation unit in Portland. He would need months of physical therapy to regain full mobility, additional surgeries to reconstruct his eye socket, and speech therapy to address facial nerve damage. Vision in his left eye was permanently impaired. He would only have light and shadow perception for the rest of his life. Cognitive damage was more subtle but still present. He had difficulty with short-term memory and occasionally struggled to find the right words. I visited Josh for the first time in rehab 3 weeks after he arrived. The place was clean but depressing, the kind of institution that tries to be cheerful with bright colors on the walls, but only manages to highlight the sadness of the people inside. Josh was in a wheelchair when I arrived, although the therapist said he could walk short distances with a walker. He had lost at least 30 pounds, his face still had visible scars, and his left side drooped slightly due to nerve damage. We talked for 40 minutes. Josh spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, pausing frequently to remember what he was trying to say. He thanked me for going to Vegas, for helping my parents through that situation. He said he remembered almost nothing of the night of the attack, only being in the casino, trying to win enough money to leave Nevada, and then waking up in the hospital without understanding where he was or what had happened. I asked him how he was coping with everything, with the reality of his situation. Josh was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the parking lot outside. Then he said that for the first time in his memory, he couldn't run away or lie to get out of his problems. His body wouldn't let him, his mind wouldn't cooperate, and there was no one left to blame or manipulate. He was stuck with the consequences of everything he had done, and that was terrifying, but also strangely liberating. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard Josh say. There was no performance there, no attempt to gain sympathy or manipulate the situation. Just a raw admission of where he was and who he had been. He said he had started therapy, not just physical but psychological as well, working with a counselor specializing in gambling addiction and personality disorders. She had diagnosed him with pathological gambling addiction and narcissistic traits, and was helping him understand the behavioral patterns that had led him there. Before leaving, Josh asked me for something. He wanted to write apology letters to everyone he had hurt, Rebecca, Melissa, Brittany, and his other girlfriends, the friends he had used, and especially our parents. But his hands still trembled too much to write legibly, and typing on the computer was frustrating with his cognitive problems. He asked if I could come a few times a week and help him write these letters, to be his scribe while he dictated what he wanted to say. My first instinct was to refuse. Why should I spend my time helping Josh redeem himself when he had spent months trying to destroy me? But then I thought of the broken man in the wheelchair in front of me, struggling to form sentences, facing years in prison when he was finally physically able to stand trial. He was already paying an immense price. If he genuinely wanted to make amends, who was I to deny him that chance? I agreed to come twice a week. Amanda didn't understand at first. She thought I was being manipulated again. But I explained that it wasn't about whether Josh deserved my help or not. It was about me being the kind of person I wanted to be. The kind who doesn't hold grudges indefinitely, who recognizes when someone is genuinely trying to change, even if it's too late to undo the damage done. She eventually agreed, but made me promise that I would set clear boundaries and not let Josh pull me back into toxic dynamics. The letter-writing sessions were intense and emotional. Josh dictated slowly, frequently pausing to cry or compose himself. The letters were brutally honest. He took full responsibility for his actions, made no excuses, and tried to justify nothing. To Rebecca, he apologized for nearly destroying her marriage with lies. To Brittany, for manipulating her feelings and stealing her money. To our parents, for betraying their trust so deeply and irreparably. The hardest letter was the one he wrote to me. It took 3 sessions to complete because Josh kept breaking down, unable to continue talking. He detailed every lie he told about me, explained how he had rationalized each one at the time, how he had convinced himself that I was the problem, that I deserved to be the villain of the story. He apologized not only for the lies, but for what they cost him. Months of alienation from his family, the attack on my career, the stress he put on my marriage. At the end of the letter, Josh wrote something that caught me off guard. He said the greatest irony of it all was that I had been the best brother he could have asked for, and that he threw that away because of addiction, selfishness, and a pathological inability to take responsibility for his own failures. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, he didn't expect our relationship to ever be the same again, but he wanted me to know that he finally understood the magnitude of what he had done and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be a better person, even if it was too late to fix what he had broken. When we finished that letter, we were both crying. Not the dramatic kind of crying, but silent tears from years of pain, anger, regret, and perhaps a very fragile and uncertain beginning of healing. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket, not knowing if I would ever be able to truly accept what was written there, but keeping it nonetheless. David Chen updated us on the criminal case at the end of July. The prosecutors were willing to offer a plea deal considering Josh's medical condition and the fact that my parents had begun making restitution payments for the fraudulent debts. 18 months in a minimum security prison, followed by 3 years of probation and continued restitution payments. He was generous, considering the extent of the crimes, and David strongly recommended that Josh accept before they changed their minds. Josh accepted the plea deal. The formal sentencing would be in September, after he completed a few more months of physical rehabilitation to ensure he was stable enough to be transferred to prison. This gave our family a few final months before Josh disappeared into the prison system for a year and a half. My mother was devastated by the inevitability of it, but also resigned. She understood that there was no other option, that Josh had committed serious crimes and needed to pay for them. During those summer months, our family began a slow and painful process of rebuilding. Not returning to what we were before, that was impossible, but building something new upon the rubble. Monthly dinners at my parents' house, where everyone participated but with a new awareness of the dynamics we had allowed to develop. Rebecca and I rebuilt our relationship. Long conversations about how we had both failed to see who Josh really was and how that had affected the whole family. My parents sold their house in Lake Oswego in August. It was painful to see them leave the place where they had lived for 15 years, but financially there was no choice. They moved to a smaller apartment in Milwaukee, closer to me, and although it was an obvious downgrade in terms of space and location, they were handling it with surprising grace. My father said that in the end it was just a house, and that the important thing was that the family had survived intact, even if hurt and changed. But not everything was resolved. There were still unresolved issues, secrets Josh had kept that would begin to surface in the following months. And when they did, we would discover that everything we had been through so far was only the surface of something much deeper and more disturbing. The full truth about who Josh was and what he had done was yet to come, and when it did, it would test the fragile boundaries of forgiveness and rebuilding that we had worked so hard to establish. The first clue that there were more secrets appeared in mid-August, when Ron called me saying he needed to talk urgently. We met at a coffee shop in Beaverton, far from anywhere we could be recognized. Ron seemed uncomfortable, which was unusual for a former police officer who had seen it all. He placed a brown folder on the table between us and said he had continued investigating Josh on his own, following some loose ends that bothered him, and that he had found something I needed to know before sentencing in September. Inside the folder were documents for a bank account I'd never seen before. It wasn't any of the banks we'd already investigated. It was an account at a small credit union in Bend, Oregon, more than 150 miles from Portland. The account was in Josh's name, opened 3 years prior, and had significant activity throughout that time. Regular deposits, usually in cash, totaling over $200,000 over the years. And equally regular withdrawals, also in cash, without any clear pattern. Ron explained that he was able to trace the account through tax records Josh had been required to file when he worked as a freelance contractor for a few months years ago. The existence of the account itself wasn't necessarily suspicious, but the sheer volume of money and the fact that Josh had never mentioned it to anyone raised serious questions. Where did all this money come from? Josh never had a job that paid enough to justify that kind of savings, especially considering his extravagant spending and gambling addiction. My stomach sank as I looked at the numbers. Ron had a theory, but he wanted to investigate further before telling me. He said he would need another 2 weeks and probably a few $1,000s more to follow the clues to the end. I agreed immediately, because something in my intuition told me that whatever Ron found would be important, maybe even change everything we thought we knew about Josh. I paid him another $5,000 from the money I had saved and told him to dig deep to find out everything. 2 weeks later, Ron returned with a report that chilled my blood. Josh wasn't just throwing money away at casinos. He was involved in something far more serious. For the past 3 years, Josh had been running an insurance fraud scheme. He bought cheap used cars, insured them for inflated amounts using forged paperwork, and then reported them as stolen or totaled in fabricated accidents. The insurance companies paid out. Josh pocketed the difference and repeated the process every few months. Ron had documentation for at least 15 different cars, each resulting in insurance payouts ranging from $10,000 to $20,000. Some of the frauds were sophisticated, involving accomplices posing as accident witnesses or auto repair shops providing false damage estimates. Josh wasn't doing this alone. He was part of a larger network of fraudsters, and the money he deposited into that account in Bend was his share of the profits. Worse still, Ron had discovered that Josh had been under investigation by the Oregon Department of Justice's Insurance Fraud Division for at least 6 months, since before the confrontation at my parents' house. They had built a solid case against him and were poised to make arrests across the network when Josh disappeared to Vegas. The beating and subsequent hospitalization had delayed the investigation, but not stopped it. As soon as Josh was sentenced for the identity fraud case against our parents, he would immediately be indicted for the insurance fraud as well. I sat there in that coffee shop, looking at the evidence, and felt like I was meeting my brother for the first time. Everything I had discovered before, the gambling addiction, the lies, the manipulation, suddenly seemed amateurish compared to this. Josh wasn't just a compulsive liar and a gambling addict. He was a professional criminal, part of an organized operation, someone who had lived a double life completely hidden from his entire family for years. I took the documents to David Chen the next day. He turned pale as he read them. He said this changed everything, that the plea deal Josh had accepted only covered the fraud against our parents. But these new charges could add years to his sentence. Insurance fraud was a federal crime, and with 15 documented cases, Josh was potentially looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison, not the 18 months he had agreed to in the state plea deal. I was paralyzed by the decision I needed to make. Did I tell my parents about it before sentencing? Did I let them have that last month of some illusion that they knew the full extent of their son's crimes? Or did I wait until after, allowing them that period of farewell before Josh went to prison without the added weight of this revelation? Amanda argued that they had a right to know, that keeping secrets, even to protect feelings, was what had allowed Josh to operate with impunity for so long. I decided to tell her. I arranged a dinner at my parents' house. Just me, Amanda, my parents, and Rebecca. I didn't mention Josh on the invitation, only that we needed to talk about something important. When we arrived, my mother had prepared lasagna, her specialty, and there was a clear attempt to create a pleasant atmosphere. My heart ached, knowing I was about to destroy any fragile peace she had managed to build in the last few weeks. I waited until after dinner, when we were sitting in the living room having coffee. I placed Ron's briefcase on the coffee table, just as I had done months ago when I first exposed Josh. This time, however, there was no audience, no performative drama, just a weary family about to receive yet another blow. I explained everything: the cars, the insurance fraud, the federal investigation, the additional years of prison Josh would face. My mother didn't cry this time. She simply remained very quiet, staring at her hands in her lap. My father asked technical questions, wanting to understand exactly how the scheme worked, how many people were involved, how much money was at stake. Rebecca grew angry, a cold, controlled anger that was more frightening than screams. She said she was fed up with discovering new layers of Josh's lies, that every time they thought they had hit rock bottom, they discovered there was even deeper. David Chen had advised us not to visit or confront Josh about this until the feds made their move officially, but I couldn't follow that advice. I showed up at Josh's rehab facility 2 days later, unannounced, and asked to speak with him privately. The nurse gave us an empty therapy room, and I slammed the door shut behind me harder than necessary. Josh knew immediately that something was wrong. He was still in a wheelchair, even though the therapist said he would soon be walking with a cane. I tossed Ron's folder into his lap and told him to open it. I watched his face as he flipped through the documents, seeing the recognition, the panic, and finally the resignation pass through his eyes. When he finished reading, he slowly closed the folder and simply said that he knew this would eventually come to light. I asked him how he could have done that, how he could have been involved in organized crime while having dinner at our parents' house every Sunday, while posting happy pictures on social media, while accusing me of being the terrible brother. Josh was quiet for a long time before answering. He said he started small, just one car, a one-off scam when he was desperate for gambling money years ago. But then he realized how easy it was, how the system had loopholes, and he met people who did it professionally. He said the money was too good to stop at, that he convinced himself he was just taking from wealthy corporations that wouldn't miss a few $100,000 spread over the years. That he never thought in terms of real victims because everything seemed so abstract, just numbers in accounts, paperwork, bureaucratic processes. Only when he was caught and forced to face the consequences did he begin to understand the magnitude of what he had done and how many lives he had affected. I told Josh that the feds would be coming after him, probably soon after the state sentencing, that he was looking at additional years in prison, that the life he knew was essentially over for the next 10 to 15 years. Josh nodded, without surprise or drama. He said he had already accepted it, that since waking up in the hospital in Vegas, he knew his life as he knew it was over, and that this was just further confirmation of what he already knew deep down. I asked if there was anything else, any more secrets, any more bombs waiting to explode. Josh thought carefully before answering. He said no, that insurance fraud was the last big thing, but that there were little things, little lies and manipulations over the years that he didn't even fully remember. That he had lived so immersed in dishonesty for so long that he couldn't always separate truth from fiction in his own memories. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, without rehearsed apology letters, without the performance of repentance. Just two brothers sitting in a sterile hospital room, one physically and emotionally broken, the other exhausted from discovering that every time he thought he knew the whole truth, there was another layer of deception. Before leaving, Josh asked me one thing, that I take care of our parents, especially Mom, when he was in prison. That they would need someone strong because this would destroy them in ways they couldn't yet foresee. I promised I would take care of them, not for Josh's sake, but because they were my parents and I loved them. But I made it clear that this was the end of my patience, that there would be no more prison visits, no more scribes' letters, no more second chances if we discovered there were even more secrets. Josh nodded in understanding, and I left that room knowing it would probably be one of the last real conversations we would have for many years. The state sentencing took place as planned in September. Josh, now walking with a cane and still visibly frail, stood before the judge and formally accepted the 18-month plea deal. The judge made some comments about the seriousness of the crimes, about the breach of family trust, but acknowledged Josh's rehabilitation efforts and his medical condition as mitigating factors. Josh would be transferred to the state prison in Sheridan, Oregon, a minimum security facility where he could continue receiving medical treatment. Exactly 1 week later, as David had predicted, federal agents showed up at the prison with a new warrant. Josh was indicted on 15 counts of insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and falsification of federal documents. Bail was denied because he was already serving time for other crimes. The federal trial was scheduled for January, and the prosecutor was seeking the maximum sentence given the prolonged pattern of criminal behavior. Our family was numb at that point. There were no more tears, no more shock or surprise. Just a weary acceptance that Josh had destroyed his own life so completely and in such a multifaceted way that it would take decades for the full consequences to unfold. My mother stopped visiting Josh in prison after the federal indictment, saying she could no longer look at him without seeing a stranger. My father immersed himself in volunteer work, keeping busy so he wouldn't have to think about his son behind bars. But for me, strangely, there was a sense of closure finally materializing. All the secrets were exposed, all the lies revealed, all the consequences being faced. Josh was going to spend the next decade or more in prison, and while it was tragic and painful, it was also just and necessary. He had made choices, choice after choice after choice, and now he was paying the full price for them all. The question that remained was what would come next. When Josh eventually got out of prison, a man in his 40s with an extensive criminal record, impaired cognitive abilities, and a family that had been destroyed by his actions. What kind of life would he have, and more importantly, what kind of relationship, if any, would I be willing to have with him? These were questions I didn't have answers to yet, and perhaps wouldn't have them for many years. But for now, it was time to focus on what I could control: my immediate family, my marriage, my daughters, my career, my parents, who were rebuilding their lives. Josh had taken so much from us in recent years, consumed so much emotional energy and financial resources. It was time to stop letting him be the center of everything and start living forward, not constantly looking back at the wreckage he left behind. Josh's federal trial took place in January 2023 in the federal court in Portland. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, ironically with the same last name I had used as an example in other stories, was relentless. She methodically presented each fraud, showing how Josh and his accomplices had systematically exploited loopholes in the insurance system, fabricated accidents, forged documents, and deceived multiple companies over 3 years. The total losses amounted to $320,000. Josh's defense, led by an overworked public defender named Marcus Reed, attempted to argue that Josh was a gambling addict who had been exploited by more sophisticated criminals, that he was more of a victim than a perpetrator. But Prosecutor Mitchell demolished that argument by showing emails and text messages where Josh clearly coordinated fraud, recruited people, and even taught others how to run the scheme. He wasn't a victim, he was one of the main organizers. I didn't go to the trial, neither did my parents nor Rebecca. David Chen represented us, providing written statements about the impact Josh's crimes had had on the family, but none of us had the stomach to sit in that courtroom and hear every sordid detail of yet another layer of betrayal. Brittany did, though. She texted me, saying she needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed closure. Afterward, she said she was struck by how cold and calculating Josh had been, how different his actions were from the persona he presented to the world. The jury took only 4 hours to deliberate, guilty on all 15 counts. The sentence came 2 weeks later. The federal judge, an older man named Thomas Bradford, was stern. He said that insurance fraud was not a victimless crime, that every dollar stolen was eventually paid for by honest consumers through higher premiums, that Josh had demonstrated a prolonged pattern of sophisticated criminal behavior that could not be attributed solely to addiction or bad luck. 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and full restitution of the $320,000 plus interest. With the state sentence Josh was already serving, he was looking at approximately 13.5 years behind bars, assuming good behavior. He would be 51 years old when he was released if all went well. More than half of his adult life would be spent in federal and state prisons. My mother stayed in bed for 3 days when she heard the sentence, unable to process the magnitude of what it meant. Losing a son to prison for over a decade was like a kind of death, an extended grief with no defined end. Life slowly began to find a new normal throughout 2023. I refocused completely on work, earning a promotion to senior project manager at Morrison & Associates in March. The Vancouver Bridge project I had been overseeing was successfully completed, on time and on budget, and this completely restored any damage the previous year's HR survey had done to my professional reputation. Mark told me he was proud of how I had handled everything, both professionally and personally. Emma and Sophie were growing up. Emma was 11 now and starting middle school, excelling in math and science. Sophie was 9 and a natural artist, always drawing and painting. They occasionally asked about Uncle Josh, vaguely remembering family gatherings before everything fell apart. Amanda and I decided to be honest with them in an age-appropriate way, explaining that Josh had made bad choices and was paying the consequences, but without going into detail about fraud, addiction, or violence. My parents adjusted to life in the smaller apartment. My father had found purpose volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, using his skills from years at Boeing to help build homes for low-income families. My mother had joined a support group for parents of incarcerated children, and although it was painful for her at first, she eventually found comfort in talking to others who understood the specific kind of pain she carried. They had visibly aged, but there was also a resilience in them that I hadn't expected. Rebecca and Greg had completely rebuilt their marriage. The near collapse caused by Josh's lies had forced them to confront problems they had been ignoring for years, and ironically, they emerged stronger. Rebecca called me regularly now, long conversations about everything and nothing, rebuilding the sibling relationship we had lost. She admitted that she had always treated Josh as her favorite, protecting him from consequences, and that this had contributed to who he became. I received Josh's first letter in April 2023, 6 months after he entered the federal system. The letter was handwritten, his handwriting shaky but legible, better than when I was in rehab. He described life in prison, not dramatically, but factually. The routine, the other prisoners, the classes he was taking to perhaps get an improved GED, or even start college credits. He was continuing therapy, both individual and group, working through his gambling addiction and the personality traits that fueled his criminal behavior. Josh didn't ask for anything in the letter. He didn't ask for visits, he didn't ask for money for the commissioner, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply shared where he was, how he was spending his days, and ended by saying he understood if I chose not to respond. I kept the letter in a drawer without replying, not yet ready to open that channel of communication. But I didn't throw it away either, which perhaps said something about where I was in the process of dealing with everything. In July, Brittany got in touch. She had married a guy she met through work, was happy, and had completely overcome the trauma of her relationship with Josh. But she had seen the news about his sentencing and wanted to know how I was processing everything. We met for coffee, and it was surprisingly therapeutic to talk to someone who had been directly hurt by Josh, but had managed to move on completely. Brittany said something that stuck with me. She said that for a long time she had blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for being so completely deceived. But eventually she realized that people like Josh, professional manipulators, are skilled at showing you exactly what you want to see, that it wasn't our fault for believing him, it was his design to make us believe, and that the only way to truly move on was to accept that some people are broken in ways we can't fix, and that our responsibility is simply to protect ourselves and learn from the experience. On Emma's birthday in September, we had a party at our house in Portland. My parents came, Rebecca and Greg, and some of Emma's friends from school. It was the first time in years that we'd had a family gathering that felt genuinely happy and relaxed. No one mentioned Josh, but his absence was felt differently now. It wasn't the throbbing open wound it had been anymore. It was more of a scar, present but not dominating everything. Amanda caught me alone in the kitchen while I was baking the cake. She hugged me from behind and said she was proud of me, of how I had navigated all of this without losing my essence, without becoming bitter or closed off. She said the girls were lucky to have a father who faced one of the worst betrayals imaginable and still chose to be kind, to be present, to keep the family together. I turned and kissed her, grateful to have had her as an anchor through the whole storm. I received another letter from Josh in October. This time, he mentioned that he had read about my promotion through my mother, who visited him once every 2 months. He said he was genuinely happy for me, that if anyone deserved success, it was me after everything I had endured. He talked about the classes I was taking, surprisingly, computer programming, something he had never shown interest in before. He said that the prison structure, however paradoxical it seemed, was working well for him in certain ways. This time I responded. Not a long letter, just half a page acknowledging that I had received his correspondence, that he was okay, that I hoped he would continue making genuine progress. I didn't offer visits or intimacy, but I also didn't completely close the door. It was a fragile middle ground, recognizing that he was still my brother while maintaining the necessary boundaries for my own mental health and that of my family. That Thanksgiving, our family gathered again. This time at Rebecca's house, a new tradition we had started. We sat around the table. My parents, Rebecca and Greg, Amanda and the girls, my cousin Melissa, who had fully reconciled with me, and a few other extended family members. When it came time to say what we were grateful for, there was a moment of hesitation before my father spoke. He said he was grateful for the truth, however painful it might be. Grateful that the secrets had been exposed before they caused even more damage. Grateful that the family had survived, changed, but intact. And especially grateful for me, for having had the courage to do the difficult thing when no one else was willing. My mother cried, but they were tears of relief and gratitude, not sadness. Rebecca raised her glass in a toast, and everyone followed suit. Sitting there at that table, surrounded by people I loved and who had gone through hell with me, I realized that we had truly overcome the worst. Josh was still in prison, and would be for many years. The wounds he inflicted still ached sometimes. The lost money would never be fully recovered, but we had something more valuable. We had truth, rebuilt trust, and a deeper understanding of each other and of ourselves. The revenge I had sought when I confronted Josh that Sunday in May 2022 had unfolded in ways I could never have predicted. It wasn't the public exposure that ultimately destroyed Josh. It was his own accumulated choices, his own actions finally catching up with him. I had only lit the fuse, but the explosion was inevitable anyway, and as I sat there watching my daughter laugh at something my father had said, I realized that destroying Josh had never truly been the goal. The goal had been to save myself, protect my family, and restore truth to a world that had been poisoned by lies. And in that, finally, I had succeeded completely. 5 years have passed since that Thanksgiving in 2023. It's November 2028 now, and I'm sitting in my home office in Portland, looking out the window at the autumn leaves falling in the yard. Emma is 16 and just got her driver's license, something that terrifies and makes me equally proud. Sophie is 14 and has been accepted into an advanced arts program at school. Amanda just got promoted to head nurse at the hospital. Life went on, as it always does, regardless of past traumas. My parents are aging with the grace that comes from having survived the unbearable. My father turned 70 this year, my mother 68. They still live in the apartment in Milwaukee, smaller than the dream house they lost. But it's theirs, and doesn't have the weight of Josh's debts attached. My mother visits Josh religiously every 6 weeks, a motherly pilgrimage she feels she needs to make. My father has only been 3 times in those 5 years, and each visit left him depressed for weeks afterward. Rebecca had a baby in 2025, a boy they named Oliver. She's 43 now, an older first-time mother, but radiant with happiness. Watching her with Oliver made me think a lot about family, about how patterns repeat or are broken, about how the wounds of one generation can be healed or passed on to the next. Rebecca is aware of this in ways our mother never was, determined to raise Oliver with clear boundaries and responsibility from an early age. I visited Josh for the first time in March 2026, almost 4 years after the original confrontation. It wasn't an easy decision. I spent months debating it with Amanda, with my therapist, whom I had started seeing in 2024, and with myself during sleepless nights. But I felt I needed to, not for Josh's sake, but for mine. I needed to look at him, see who he had become after years in prison, and finally decide what kind of relationship, if any, I would be willing to have when he was eventually released. The federal prison where Josh was being held in Sheridan was exactly as I had imagined. High fences, barbed wire, guards with neutral expressions processing visitors through multiple checkpoints. I sat in the visiting room, those plastic tables with uncomfortable chairs bolted to the floor, and waited. When Josh entered, escorted by a guard, I almost didn't recognize him. He was 44 but looked 50, grey hair, thinner, walking with a slight limp remaining from the beating in Vegas. We sat facing each other, an awkward silence between us initially. Josh spoke first, thanking me for coming, saying he hadn't expected me to, that he had accepted that our relationship was over. His voice was different, softer, without the manipulative tone I had come to recognize. I asked how he was, and he was honest in a way that was almost shocking coming from him. He said the first few years had been hell, adjusting to the reality of prison, dealing with the guilt, the nightmares, the moments of panic when he thought about how many years he still had ahead of him. Josh recounted that he had hit rock bottom emotionally in 2024, had seriously considered suicide, and even had a plan. But the prison psychologist, a man named Dr. Hassan, had intervened at just the right moment. They worked together intensively for months, unpacking not only the gambling addiction, but also the childhood traumas that Josh had never processed, the distorted thought patterns he had developed, and the pathological need to be the center of attention, even if it meant lying and creating drama. He said he had finally been formally diagnosed, not only with pathological gambling addiction, but also with narcissistic personality disorder and borderline traits. Having these diagnoses, understanding that his brain functioned differently, didn't excuse what he did but helped to contextualize it. He was on medication now, mood stabilizers that helped with impulsivity and extreme emotional highs and lows. And for the first time in his life, he was doing consistent therapy, real and difficult work of confronting who he was and who he wanted to become. I asked him directly if he still thought about gambling, if the addiction still called to him. Josh was honest. He said yes, especially in the early years. That he saw other prisoners playing cards for favors or items from the commissary and felt that familiar pull, that adrenaline rush. But that he had learned coping techniques and, more importantly, he had understood that gambling for him was never really about money. It was about escaping, about feeling something, about creating drama and emotion in a life that otherwise felt empty or meaningless. We talked for 2 hours on that first visit. Josh didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't ask to restore our relationship, didn't make promises about the future. He simply shared where he was, the work he was doing, and acknowledged that he had destroyed any right to expect anything from me or the family. When we said goodbye, he extended his hand, and after hesitating, I shook it. It wasn't a hug, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something, an acknowledgement that we were both different people than we were on that Sunday in 2022. I visited Josh 3 more times in the following years, not frequently, but regularly enough to see genuine progress. He completed his GED, then began college credits through a prison program, studying accounting ironically, something about understanding numbers and systems in a legitimate way this time. He was working in the prison library, helping other prisoners with basic literacy. There was a humility in him now that was completely absent before, an acceptance of his condition and a focus on doing what he could with the time he had. Ron Delgado, the private investigator who had helped expose Josh, called me out of the blue in August 2028. He said he had continued to casually monitor Josh's case, more out of professional interest than anything else, and he had discovered something he thought I should know. The insurance fraud scheme Josh was involved in had been much larger than anyone realized. 11 people were eventually indicted, including Josh, and the total operation defrauded over $2 million over 5 years. But what's most interesting is that Josh had cooperated with federal investigators eventually, providing information that helped to completely dismantle the network. He had testified against two of the main organizers in exchange for nothing, without a reduced sentence, simply because it was the right thing to do. His testimony had put two very bad people in prison for a long time. Ron said that the feds rarely see this kind of cooperation without a plea deal, which showed a genuine change of character. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me was angry that Josh had never mentioned it during our visits, that he was keeping yet another secret, even if it was a positive one this time. But another part recognized that maybe he was trying to make amends in ways that didn't involve seeking credit or recognition, that he was finally learning that not everything needs to be performative or about getting something in return. Josh's release date is set for May 2031, just over 2.5 years from now. He will be 51 years old, having spent more than 8 years behind bars when all his time is accounted for. He will emerge into a world completely different from the one he entered, with advanced technology, a changed political landscape, and a family fundamentally altered by the experience. He has no job waiting for him, no home to return to, no savings or resources. David Chen has already begun working on a reintegration plan. There are programs for ex-convicts, especially those who completed education and vocational training in prison. Josh will likely start in a halfway house, work entry-level jobs, and rebuild his life brick by brick. It will be difficult, perhaps impossible, considering his extensive criminal record and the residual physical limitations from the beating, but it will be his journey to make, not ours. I had a long conversation with Emma and Sophie about Uncle Josh recently. They're old enough now to understand the whole story, or at least the age-appropriate version. I explained the addiction, the fraud, the lies, the prison. But I also explained about second chances, about how people can change, and about how justice sometimes means both punishment and the opportunity for redemption. Emma asked if I hated Josh. I thought carefully before answering. I said no, that I didn't hate him, that I had hated him for a while, that the anger had been consuming and justified. But that hatred is too heavy to carry indefinitely, and that eventually I had to choose between letting Josh define me through anger or reclaiming my own life separate from him. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing, it just means letting go of the poison so it doesn't poison you too. Sophie, always the most emotional, asked if Josh would be a part of our lives when he left. I honestly said I didn't know, that it would depend a lot on who he was when he left. My parents are planning to let Josh live with them temporarily when he's released. It's not ideal. They're in their 70s and need peace, not drama. But they're parents, and the instinct to care for a child, even one who caused so much harm, never truly dies. We've established clear boundaries, though. Rules Josh will need to follow if he wants to live with them. No games of any kind, not even recreational cards, mandatory ongoing therapy, full-time work as soon as he gets a job. Financial contribution to the apartment. One violation, and he's out. Rebecca is more hesitant about having Josh back in her life. She has Oliver to protect now, and very vivid memories of how Josh nearly destroyed her marriage with lies. She said she's willing to give him a chance, but it will be years before she trusts him around her son, unsupervised. It's fair and understandable. Trust, once broken so completely, takes generations to rebuild, if it's ever fully rebuilt at all. As for me, I've reached a place of precarious peace. I haven't forgotten what Josh did. I never will. The scars from those years, 2021 to 2023, are still with me, surfacing at unexpected moments. When someone tells me a story that sounds too good to be true, my first instinct is to doubt. When I see news about fraud or family manipulation, I feel a knot in my stomach. When my daughters lie about something small, I overreact in ways that aren't justified by the transgression. But I also learn things about myself through this ordeal. I learned that I am stronger than I thought, capable of enduring unthinkable betrayal and still functioning, still being a present father and husband. I learned that revenge, when justified and executed with precision, can bring a sense of justice but not necessarily healing. I learned that family is as much a choice as it is a matter of blood, and that sometimes protecting your family means setting strict boundaries with the people you love. I learned that the truth, however painful, is always preferable to living in lies, even comfortable ones. I learned that forgiveness is a process, not an event, and that it's possible to forgive someone while still maintaining a protective distance from them. And I learned that destroying someone, even when deserved, is not a lasting satisfaction. What lasts is rebuilding, focusing on what you can control, choosing to be defined by your own actions, not by the actions of those who hurt you. Sitting here now looking at the photos on my desk, Emma and Sophie laughing on the beach last summer, Amanda and I on our 20th wedding anniversary, my parents holding Oliver in the hospital when he was born, I see what truly matters. Josh took so much from us, years of peace, hundreds of thousands of dollars, innocent family trust. But he didn't take everything. He didn't take our love for each other, our resilience, our ability to rebuild. When Josh gets out of prison in 2031, he'll find a different family than the one he left behind. More cautious, more aware of toxic dynamics, more willing to set boundaries. But also a family that survived the worst and came out stronger, more honest. If he has genuinely changed, if he has done the work, if he is committed to living differently, then perhaps there is room for him in this new configuration. A small space, carefully defined, but space nonetheless. And if nothing has changed, if it's all just performance again, if the old patterns resurface, then at least this time we know what to look for. We know the warning signs, we know how to protect each other, and we know we're strong enough to make the tough choices even when they hurt. Josh won't catch us off guard again. That's the guarantee I can make to my family and to myself. The story of how I caught my brother lying and destroyed him doesn't end with his destruction. It ends here, years later, with a family rebuilt from the rubble, with lessons learned through pain, and with the understanding that sometimes loving someone means letting them face the full consequences of their actions, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, because that's the only way real change can happen. Josh destroyed himself through his choices. I simply refused to be destroyed along with him, and in the end, that was the most complete revenge I could have had. Not his downfall, but my survival. Not his imprisonment, but my freedom. Not his end, but the beginning of my family's new life. This is the story my daughters will know, the story they will carry into their own lives. That truth matters, that consequences are real, and that it's possible to survive the unthinkable if you refuse to give up on yourself. And as I write these final words, as I definitively close this chapter of my life, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Gratitude, not for what Josh did, but for what surviving this taught me. About strength, about family, about complicated forgiveness and conditional love when necessary. These lessons came at a high price, but they were invaluable, and I will carry them with me for the rest of my life, not as wounds, but as hard-won wisdom. The story is over. Life goes on. And finally, that's enough.